Had it all one day, threw it all away, took my leave with no goodbye, bought some company, bragged on we were free, left and looked at him even far away in a foreign place where the hunger's now my soul. Still my heart would long for love's old sweet songs and a fire when the nights were cold. There's a road somewhere, there's an open door, there's a hill where the green grass grows, there's a family feast where there's joy and peace, going back to a place called fickle friends are gone, wasted years along, and regret can bring you low. But there's a sweet embrace, there's amazing grace. There's a place where love's eyes go. There's a road somewhere, there's an open door, there's a hill where the green grass grows, there's a family feast where there's joy and peace, going back to a place called going back to a place called
Hello, Jess.
Go ahead, Ma'am Nympha.
Okay, I could not see this way. Okay. This morning, we will be having a lecture on General Introduction on Abuse. Our lecturer graduated in Washington Adventist University in Bachelor of Science in Nursing, magna cum laude. And also she has Master of Science in Nursing in Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. on family nurse practitioner and public health clinic as a public health clinical nurse specialist or CNS. And her Doctor of Philosophy at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing in Baltimore with a focus on family violence and health outcomes, with a dissertation titled The Role of Religious Involvement in the Relationship Between Early Traumatic Stress and Health Outcomes Among Adventist Adults. Thus, our speaker, she is well knowledgeable in the title that she is going to speak today. So Dr. Katia Reinert, I'm giving you the time now to give the lecture.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. And I want to send our greetings to all the attendees. And it's so fitting that you have chosen this topic today to discuss, because this is so important for comprehensive health ministry. So I salute Dr. Elaine Panoso and her team, all of you represented here, the planning committee, for really including this very, very important topic of abuse, especially sexual abuse, which we are focusing the most today. And it's a delight for me to be able to participate to talk about this very important issue, which is something that I have a passion to, as described from some of the studies that I have done. And so again, I hope that what we'll share will be able to enhance what we already know about, bringing wholeness to people. And in this case, bringing also elements of prevention, but also of recovery for survivors of abuse. And so without further ado, let me just start my screen here and see if I can share with you our presentation today. So again, what we will do for this first hour is to discuss some general overview of abuse and its impact, with some emphasis on sexual abuse. And then we will forward on to talk about what the church can do. So during this first hour, I want to particularly spend time doing the overview of the different types of abuse. Also, you will see that there are a lot of health consequences to abuse, to the experience of abuse. And so we'll discuss those, and also what are some protective factors for survivors, what are resiliency factors that we can discuss. And then we will, on the second part, the second lecture, discuss what the faith communities can do in terms of the local church, the community, the workplace, as well as the schools. And we'll discuss the End Now initiative, some things that we have learned from that initiative, and also further resources that maybe will be helpful for faith communities, and particularly the Adventist Church, to discuss. So I don't think I need to tell you, but of course we're doing this overview, and just as a summary, this is a major health problem around the world. Abuse and violence of all sorts really has grown exponentially. There is a contagious of violence, and it's something that every country is dealing with. It is a hidden problem. Oftentimes it affects all levels of society. All the denominations and faith groups are not exempt, and there's a very high health costs, as we will show, and it can oftentimes lead to disability and health problems and even death for survivors. And so it's something that we really must include in comprehensive health ministries. And as I said, I'm so glad that this has been included here. Of course, when we talk about abuse, we have to also make sure to mention that right now, in the situation we are in with a pandemic of COVID-19, side by side, there is the pandemic, of abuse that has exponentially increased. And the World Health Organization has also been addressing this issue, particularly abuse against children, women, and older people. During this COVID-19 pandemic, this has increased. As you can see here, there has been, depending on the country, 10 to 50% of increase of domestic violence calls in some countries, 3 times also increase in intimate partner violence, which is one type of abuse or violence type that came from China, but this is not just in there. We see this in many other countries. We see this in America and in UK, in other continents as well. And in this case here, as an example, in India, more than 92,000 child abuse reports in one of the helplines, the helplines that were used. And so we know this is a major issue, 10 times the increase in abuse and neglect of older people as well. So there is abuse in many different forms, and we want to recognize that during this time of a pandemic, we need to be even more concerned of what can we do, and really encourage people to seek help to also work on prevention strategies. Now, in terms of forms of violence and abuse, I mentioned a few in the previous slide, but this is just a list. So you have domestic violence, where violence occurs or abuse occurs within a home among family members. You have another term called intimate partner violence, where abuse occurs among intimate partners. They could be husband and wife. They could be boyfriends, girlfriends, you know, it could be significant others, people of, in some countries where they have the same-sex marriage or same-sex relationships, this is also, there's abuse in that case as well. So anytime there is intimate partners abusing each other, it's called intimate partner violence. Of course, child abuse you're familiar with. Child abuse is abuse against children younger than 18 years old. That's usually the definition. Then you have elder abuse, which are older adults that sometimes experience abuse and neglect from you know, their children or other people caring for them. Now, those are different types. We can mention other types of violence like youth violence, etc. But we're focusing primarily on abuse here. In terms of abuse, there's also types of abuse. We talk about physical abuse or assault, sexual abuse of assault, which is the focus of today. But there's also emotional and verbal abuse, which is very common. There's also neglect of a child, of an older parent or older adult, or even neglect of our own family members. That can be considered in some countries as abuse as well. So some countries include that as a form of abuse. And then there's also witnessed abuse in the home. When children are watching their parents, you know, go through fights, or the father abusing the mother or vice versa, the child also has an impact of witnessing that abuse. And in many countries now, they are including witness abuse as a form of abuse, a child abuse as well. Even though they are not being hurt, the child is not being physically hurt themselves, by watching that, the impact on them is such as though they were having the abuse themselves. And so this is very important. Now, of course, there's also other kinds of more culturally related forms of abuse, particularly against the gender of women. We call it gender violence against women. And these are honor killings, female genital mutilation, sex trafficking, and child marriages, usually focusing on the girl child or women. And so not every country experiences this, but we need to mention that because there are some countries where you see that. Now, all these forms of abuse, what they have in common is that you see here on the right, this what we like to call power wheel. And this power wheel actually helps to explain the forms of abuse and how it comes about. Oftentimes, the person who perpetrates the abuse, it's all about control and power over the person who is being victimized. And so you see coercion and threats being done. That's a form of abuse. You can see, for instance, intimidation. It could be verbal intimidation, as well as, you know, gestures, and even, you know, violent movements and breaking things. That's a form of intimidation. It can also be other things, such as economic abuse, that can sometimes happen in a home. Sometimes the perpetrator may use a child to actually make the other spouse feel guilty. And so that is also a form of abuse. And sometimes, you know, things like minimizing the problem, blaming the person who is being abused, that it's their fault, and that's why they're being abused, or even denying that there's abuse. No, this is not abuse. I am just talking to you, or I'm just, you know, I'm the person in charge. And unfortunately, in a lot of cultures, sometimes there is a power difference between, you know, male, female, and many times in cultures where there's male privilege and the female is seen as subordinate, sometimes that is used as a form of coercing the other person, or having control over the other gender of, in this case, females. And that can be a huge issue as well. So this is just kind of like an overview of many forms of abuse and violence, so that even though we're going to be focusing on the sexual abuse, I think it's important for us to understand that abuse is really a cycle that is very similar in many different ways to the impact that it has in people. And so it's important for us, for instance, of course, to understand sexual violence and abuse in a special way. And since we're focusing on that today, I wanted to just give a definition that the World Health Organization has, which is any sexual act, any attempt to obtain a sexual act by violence or coercion, when it's unwanted by the other person. And you can actually sometimes just do verbal unwanted sexual comments or advances on someone, such as in the case of sexual harassment in a workplace or in another setting. Or it can also be acts directed against somebody's sexuality, regardless of the relationship that the person has with the other person. So this is considered one of the most traumatic of all of the types of abuse that I mentioned. Sexual abuse is very pervasive and is one of the most common human rights violations that we know of, and it's considered a major issue. The impact of sexual abuse and violence is really even more strong in many ways sometimes than some of the other ones that I mentioned, such as physical neglect or emotional abuse. But all of them leave scars. Now, sexual abuse can often happen, as I mentioned, in an intimate partner setting, or even for people that are not intimate partners in a domestic setting. But it can also happen in the church. It can happen in a school between, you know, teachers or other staff and children, or even other students, like in college. It can happen in any setting. And so that's why today, as we talk about prevention, we need to cover all those settings: in a workplace, in a community, in a school, as well as in the church. And this is something that can happen to adults, but many times, and you probably have seen a lot of issues with faith communities, and some different faith communities sometimes talk more about it, but there has been quite a bit of abuse against children. And many times the child is someone who is vulnerable because they cannot speak for themselves. They are certainly in a lower power level compared to an adult, and oftentimes they are terrible victims of this. And so in 2017, there was a report that the WHO put out, specifically talking about how can we respond to child and adolescents who have been sexually abused. And again, as I mentioned, a child is anyone younger than 18 years old, according to the UN Convention of the Rights of a Child. And then also it overlaps a little bit with the World Health Organization definition of the adolescent. And so it's important for us to remember that oftentimes one of the most common forms of abuse are actually child and adolescent abuse. And again, an adolescent Oftentimes is between ages of 15 or 12 or even 19 years old, depending where they are. Young adolescents are defined between 10 and 14, and then older adolescents between 15 and 19. And so for this group, especially important that we take care for prevention and for really trying to make them all that we can to help the in this case survivor. We like to call them survivors and not victims, because it's really everybody can survive and be a survivor. And so oftentimes child sexual abuse involves a child or an adolescent in activities that they do not understand or even comprehend. They're not able to give consent for that behavior. And many times they are not developmentally prepared for it. Sometimes a child is too young and cannot even, it can be hurting them. And children can also, of course, most commonly be abused at home by people that are known to them, like adults that's supposed to care for them, but oftentimes end up being perpetrators. So they oftentimes are in a position of power, compared to the child, and trust oftentimes, and usually a family member of a close relative. So anytime that this adult is trying to satisfy their urges or gratify themselves sexually using a child, that is pretty much the definition. And you can see here, if you have time to read some of this, but I'm just going over some of the basic things. And child sexual abuse many times happens without physical force. The person oftentimes lures the child, talking to them, manipulating them psychologically, emotionally, so they maybe will not say anything, but oftentimes afterwards there is intimidation so that the child won't talk about it. And that can happen also with adults, but particularly because of vulnerability of children, is important for us to be aware that this is a major issue. So that gives us a little bit of a sense of the problem that we have. Now, just to go a little further to talk about why is this such a problem, is because unfortunately there are major lasting consequences for survivors of whether they're adults or children, especially. There are health consequences. First, there are, of course, deep unseen scars. Sometimes those experiences are hidden by shame, by guilt. Oftentimes the person who is being victimized feels guilty, that maybe it's their fault. And many times they're led to believe that somehow they could have prevented it if they did something. And that is not the case. There's no excuse for abuse, and there is never ever the fault of the person being victimized. But these lasting consequences also have to do with spiritual wounds. We know that people that experience abuse, particularly sexual abuse, but all forms of abuse for sure, it's more difficult for them to relate to God in a healthy way sometimes, because they say, where was God when this was happening to me? And so there's spiritual wounds that we need to also be looking for and be aware of. There's also, of course, as we mentioned, is a global health problem. There's a lot of health consequences, physiological, psychological health outcomes, as well as physical health outcomes. And I'll just briefly list to you all the amounts of consequences related to health that sometimes people do not realize. So for instance, for women, and by the way, in many of the types of abuse that I mentioned, women are oftentimes more, the prevalence is higher among women than males, although males can also experience abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental, emotional. But when you compare the percentages, much of the, particularly sexual abuse for sure, it's much higher among women. And I will show you in a little bit the prevalence on the study that I have done within the Adventist Church in North America, so you can see the proportions. But women oftentimes carry the blunt of this, and so there are reproductive problems that sometimes results from sexual abuse, but also other forms of abuse like unintended pregnancies, abortions, adverse pregnancies, and other problems with their baby, their infant. And also, of course, sexual transmitted diseases or infections like HIV/AIDS and others. Now, there are also other health consequences during pregnancy for women, like the baby may be born with a low weight gain, anemia for her, infections, all kinds of bleedings may happen, as well as depression, suicidal tendencies, and even a higher risk of using drugs, alcohol, tobacco. All of that comes as a consequence for survivors, and we need to be aware of that. And this is what has been seen in studies during pregnancy. Now, there are other health problems that sometimes we do not even think, but now we know for sure that there are specific health problems, physical health, as well as mental health problems that come from being a survivor of that particular experience of sexual abuse or other forms of abuse. Here are some examples: high blood pressure, high blood sugar or glucose, overweight, or obesity, cholesterol being high. All of these that usually we tend to think, oh, they are hereditary, they're related to diet, they are related to lifestyle. Guess what? It's also higher among people who have experienced abuse. So we have to be aware of that. We also see depression, more of a mental health thing, PTSD, suicidal ideas, and as I said earlier, substance abuse. So these are chronic health problems that are very commonly seen among survivors. Another one is, of course, other things like headaches, like pain, difficulty sleeping, and other things like asthma even, or diabetes, irritable bowel syndrome, all health problems that are also seen in a higher prevalence among the survivors. Here are other things that we see specifically in terms of mental health. You see panic disorders as well. And again, for people that are survivors of child abuse, now looking at particularly child abuse, we see all of these different things as well. It's not just the adult, but also if you were experiencing sexual abuse as a child or any other form of abuse as a child, you have higher chances, much higher, of having all of these things: depression, cancer, obesity, substance abuse, type 2 diabetes, and other cardiovascular problems. So we have to keep that in mind, again, with comprehensive health ministry, that there are many other things. In this case here, you see specifically mental health consequences of child abuse. And you see here, again, the fear, shame, guilt, stigma that is surrounding it, and oftentimes leads to poor quality of life. People can have more anxiety, again, and all this is, by the way, just by witnessing violence. They did not suffer violence themselves, but they are witnessing abuse or violence in the home. Research shows that they are much higher risk of having anxiety, suicide attempts, drug and alcohol abuse, and all of these other things in this list. So again, that's why nowadays, as I mentioned, just witnessing violence can be considered as well as a form of violence. Now, how does that happen? Well, here is just an example for you to see. In 2013, the WHO put out a report showing the pathways and health effects of particularly intimate partner violence and also non-partner sexual violence. And you can see here the physical trauma, psychological trauma, fear and control, and how that can lead to various issues related to physical health as well as mental health, and the kinds of diseases that, and substance abuse, and like I said earlier, the sexual and reproductive health aspect of things. And eventually that can lead to disability and death. And death can come by homicide, by suicide, or other forms as well because of the chronic diseases. So there is enough evidence for us to really know for sure this is a serious thing that we need to prevent, and we need also to help survivors to find ways to recover from that experience and build resilience so that we don't see these results. Now, it would be wonderful if you would say, oh, but this happens to people out there. The reality is not just out there, it happens in the church as well. And I don't have to tell you, I think we all now more than ever realize how this is so pervasive. And as I said earlier, all faiths experience this, but the Seventh-day Adventist Church is among the faiths that also see high levels of abuse. And I wanted to actually show you because, in fact, there has been some research done, not in every division, but we have done some research among different segments of the church that shows prevalence of intimate partner violence, as well as adverse childhood experiences. And the adverse childhood experience, adverse childhood experiences comes from a group of studies that has looked at children being abused and the impact that that has on their health long term, as I just mentioned. And so in my particular research, I looked at child abuse within the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America. And I will show you a little bit the prevalence and some of the findings on that. But there has been other research looking at intimate partner violence among some segments of the church among adults. And so we know that more needs to be done in terms of us looking at policies regarding workers, clergy, other leaders, you know, as well as educators and members of the church. So I wanted just to give you a little bit of what we have found in some of the research we have done. Reinert in 2006 looked, as I mentioned, into a segment in the northwestern part of the US in North America in a conference there. And she looked at 1,431 adults, both men and women. And she found that almost 34% of the women and more than 20% of men had reported being assaulted by an intimate partner, physically, sexually, or verbally. And she found that many of them tried to cope with that through prayer, but many times they did not seek necessarily help. They tried to talk to their abusers. They talked to maybe a few of them, 42% sought mental health professionals, but only 11% called for help on a hotline. But you can see here, these are Adventists, 23% considered suicide, 19% used alcohol, 13% found a way to take revenge, and 15% of them also struck back violently against the perpetrator. So these are some of the things that she found in that particular sample in North America. Now, as I mentioned, I've done some research based on the Adventist Health Study, looking at the Adventists that were part of this study in a subgroup that was the religious, the behavior, religion, health study within the Adventist Health Study. And I looked at 10,283 adults, both men and women. And these were people who have had some kind of experience. And I asked, what kind of experience have you had in terms of abuse when you were younger? Below 18 years old. So looking for child abuse. And here you can see I looked at 5 different types of abuse: physical, emotional, sexual abuse, as we mentioned, and also neglect and witnessed intimate partner violence against the parents. And then, you know, you can see some of the stratification here. In red, you see males. In green, you see females. Also, I divided between whites and blacks in that particular context because there were some differences in there. And you can see here many different numbers. I'll show you a different slide that is easier to see the prevalence. But I wanted to just show you here that the question was, how many of these 5 types of abuse have you experienced before the age of 18? And then some people said, oh, I experienced only physical health. Some people experienced both physical and emotional. Some people experienced, you know, various combinations of this. And the truth is that 67% of the entire 10,283 people, in other words, more than 5,000 of them, actually closer to 6,700 of them said that they had at least one type of these abuse in their home. That included neglect and witness abuse. So we know that is very high prevalence just in that sample of people who had some form of experience with abuse. And this is, you can see down below that this has been published, and you can access that publication in this particular journal here. Now, just as a summary, when you look at the different types of abuse, 38% of that population showed they had physical abuse. In other words, you know, a huge number, almost more than close to 4,000 of the 10,000 actually said, I had experienced physical abuse as a child. In terms of emotional abuse, again, almost, you know, 4 in 10 of them said they had emotional abuse. Close to 3 people among 10 of the group, 3 in 10 or 28% said they had actually witnessed abuse in the home. 29% said they had experienced neglect, and 23% said that they had some form of sexual abuse. And this is pretty high. When you look at abuse numbers, it usually runs between 20% for women, you know, around the world, and or, you know, depending on the population you look at, but usually is in the 20s. So the church actually in our population was very close. And this is particularly, as you will see, women. Here you have the comparison between males and females. And you can see here that pretty much all of the types of abuse, with the exception of physical abuse, in this particular sample, or this group of people, all of them except physical abuse were much higher among women. And you know, especially sexual abuse. You see here in green that among males, there was a little over 3,000 of them. 12% of them said they had some form of sexual abuse as a child. And among females, we had almost more than twice as much, you know, 28% said that they experienced sexual abuse. So again, much higher, especially in the case of sexual abuse, which is what we are focusing primarily on today. So we know that women are at much greater risk. And in fact, if you look in general around the world, 1 in 3 of the world's women will experience some kind of violence in their lifetime. And in some countries, this is actually up to 70%. So it's a huge number. And again, throughout the world, there's all forms of you know, how this takes place. It usually in a family, usually husbands, it could be relatives or intimate partners, it could be within the community, sometimes strangers, it could be in schools or in the workplace. And sometimes it could be in wartime and post-conflict situations, unfortunately. So this actually is also not only in the church, as we talk here, but it could be anywhere. Now, among young adults, just so you see, these are some of the statistics that have come out in some places among young adult sexual abuse specifically. According to this, in the adolescent age, 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted during the time as a young adult in college. And this is really huge compared to men. Only 4% of male college students would be, but 20% of women. And you see here, 42% of these women who are raped, they usually don't tell anybody because there's a lot of shame. It's estimated that only about 5% of the sexual assaults on a college campus are reported. And this makes sexual assault the most underreported crime, you know, that we know of, because there's so many that don't talk about it. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of unintended pregnancies in this case, more than 32,000 pregnancies each year that result from rape. And about 4 out of every 5 rape victims, usually, as we pointed out, will have some form of chronic physical or mental health condition. And so many of them, about 40%, will have sexual transmitted illnesses because of the sexual assault. And unfortunately, 42% of them expect that they will be raped again. And so we see that survivors are 13 times more likely to, because of all these things, attempt suicide. And so it's something that really requires us to be aware. And we talk a lot about helping our institutions and our church and our schools and our hospitals or even our communities having trauma-informed ministries and care. Because once we are more aware that this is a reality, we need to be able to identify who are the people, particularly in health ministries, that we are trying to help people be healthy and live healthy lives. Helping to identify who are people who have experienced these things will help us to see that they have a much higher risk for depression, suicide, and many other the things that we mentioned, and we can do something to provide care for them. Unfortunately, I wanted to bring this up because it's a very important element. We know that sometimes we don't talk about this, but there is a huge amount of clergy sexual misconduct. And this is a problem in our church as it is in every other faith community. And I think it's important for us to be aware of this. Yeah, it can happen with teachers. It can happen with other workers in the church as well. But particularly clergy, I wanted to bring this up because this is when a pastor or a clergy, somebody has a sex with a minor. And it's a major problem in most of our countries. We see that many times there's myths about this. And these are 7 myths that I wanted to make sure that we debunk. So the one is that oftentimes we think, yes, it's true. Clergy will have sex with a minor. That is a type of clergy sexual misconduct. But is that the only type? No, there's many different ways that clergy or pastors may have been perpetrating sexual abuse. And it's not only when it's a minor, it can be with an adult, it can be with others as well. Another myth is that Adventist pastors never engage in sexual misconduct. That is not true. So unfortunately, as I mentioned, it does happen. Another myth is pastors sometimes have affairs with church members. Yeah, well, that might be true, but the reality is that many times there is an emphasis from clergy to use their power, their spiritual, position. And that, as I mentioned earlier, in that power wheel is a form of intimidating or actually luring the person that trusts the pastor. And oftentimes it's seen as an affair, but in reality, most of the time there is an intentional approach to ensure that that member ends up falling for the pastor. And we'll talk a little later some signs of what that may be. Another myth is that clergy sexual misconduct happens unintentionally. As I mentioned, most of the time the clergy is very aware of what's happening and is even intending for that to happen and to put a person in a situation in which they would fall. Spiritual pastors are above temptation. That is not true. All of us have temptations, and pastors including in this list. Number 6 is Adventists have largely been silent about abuse. That is not true. It's true that sometimes there are people that are silent and many people don't talk about it, but as you will see when we discuss what the church can do, as a church, we have been talking about this for decades. And so more and more, we have been trying to speak out and trying to break the silence of abuse. And number 7, there is equal gender representation in decision-making groups that oversees clergy sexual misconduct policy and clergy sexual misconduct allegations against pastors. Unfortunately, this is a myth. Usually, these committees that look at policy and allegations against clergy do not include females. Usually, it's a male group or there's no equal gender representation. And unfortunately, that is a problem that hopefully we can see change as we discuss now. More than ever, the church is really focused on doing something about this. And as I mentioned on the previous slide about the intention of the clergy to many times look for the victim that would be easier to, as a predator to really convince, there are steps that many times they are grooming the person to fall. And so I'm not going to go into details of all this because I'll make this available for you to look later. But many times, step one here, the pastor wants to gain the person's trust. Sometimes they physically isolate that person on a one-on-one meeting, for instance, or a counseling session, for instance. A third one, it may be short hugs that the pastor may give in a meeting, or just parting with the members. And I know that sometimes culturally this could be more common in some cultures, but we have to be aware of this. Oftentimes, another step is moving that person into emotional isolation. And so that also needs to be looked at. And then there's other things like using flattery with the member, or sometimes making them feel special, buying a gift, or some special pastor's attention to that person. And, and then by step 6 here, the perpetrator is enmeshed with that person and their life and their problems, and trying to help them, and or at least showing that they want to help them, befriending their family and other people involved, the children sometimes as well. And it becomes very difficult. And then, of course, many times the person ends up seeing themselves in their relationship and not knowing what to do. There is psychological isolation in private, and many times other situations happen that the pastor ends up isolating that person, criticizing their family or their friends, their spouse, and many times then sharing information about their own problems in their marriage as a clergy, and their loneliness and marital dissatisfaction. And then there's a recipe for problems, because as it is in these steps, which are commonly seen among sexual abuse predators, the perpetrator ends up being then encompassing that survivor, that victim, in a very vulnerable situation, in their place of least resistance. And then they move, make their move, and it goes beyond hugs to sexual touching. And then suddenly the person is who is being victimized doesn't see the way out. And so these are things that we need to educate people about. And then as we talk about what the church can do, we can discuss some of these things. As I mentioned, though, just in closing now the session, I want to just to talk about in our Adventist health study that I did here, we looked at the health outcomes of those people, and that said that they had at least one or even more than 3 types of abuse, or more than 5 types of abuse. And for those of you who like statistics, you can see here this slide actually is talking about how the number of types of abuse experienced by someone impacts their health. So for people, for instance, in blue that had at least one type or more, you can see that they had worse, negative mental and physical health scores. But if they had at least 3 types of abuse, let's say they had neglect as well as sexual abuse and mental abuse, then their health outcomes was worse. And if they had all 5, and there was a group that had all 5 types, you can see how worse was their health. Now, this was regardless of their diet, their exercise, their healthy practices that we controlled for, their income, and their education. And so, and their age, I should say. So regardless of other lifestyle things they were doing right, still that experience of abuse had a worsening of their health. With more types of abuse experience, worse their health was, and all statistically significant. Now, the good news is that we also identified factors that help them be resilient. And in that situation, we know that there are things that survivors can do and that is in place that can help them reverse and minimize the negative impact on health. These are protective factors. And we need to be able to help build that. And we'll talk more about that on the next presentation. But we need to remember that God came to help the brokenhearted, to give comfort for those who are mourning losses, such as the loss of, for some, of their purity or virginity, or having experienced that abuse. Really, there's a lot of losses that come with this, and many survivors or victims carry their ashes with them, but Christ is able to bring and give us the oil of joy, and help those with the spirit of heaviness to experience praise. And so healing is available also for survivors. And I looked in our research, we looked at religious involvement and spirituality as a way to actually protect people from these results. And in fact, we found that forgiveness, gratitude, having a deep relationship with God, and other forms of religious involvement helped to reduce the negative impact on health. And so, there's good news. And I think as a church, and we'll talk about this on the second part, there's a lot that we can do for prevention, but also for recovery of survivors, so that they can have this resilience and improve their health outcomes in every way, physically, mentally, spiritually, and live the lives that God has intended for them to live.
Ate Nympha,
Yes.
kindly moderate
Thank
for
you
the
so much,
question.
Dr. Katia. I'm sure everybody has enjoyed listening, because this is what is really happening nowadays. So let's go to our question and answer. I saw 3 questions here. First question is, what is emotional isolation? Please give example.
Okay, I'm trying to see here how I can stop sharing. Hold on a second here, so that you can see me better. Anyway, I don't know how to do it here. Emotional isolation. Oh, here we go. You can see me better now. So emotional isolation comes oftentimes when someone uses, like, again, the perpetrator who has the power and has the control, tries to isolate the victim, or I like to say the survivor of abuse, from people who they are attached to emotionally. So in other words, they will use tactics to actually make that person distance themselves from family, from friends, from those that they are emotionally close. And by doing that, they isolate that person, and they, the perpetrator, becomes the only emotional support that that person has. Does that make sense? So emotional isolation, this is one form of emotional isolation, is where, it's a strategy of a perpetrator of sexual abuse to actually, as I said, sometimes criticize their friends, or say, let's say it doesn't have to be just, like I mentioned, clergy, but it could be anyone else, could be a teacher, it could be a friend, it could be a family member who is not an intimate partner, and they may use this strategy to criticize people in the family, anybody who is close to that person, and then actually isolate them emotionally, so that suddenly they are just going for that perpetrator for their emotional support, and it becomes a cycle where there is isolation from people who normally would or be close to them and give them emotional support, but now they become much more vulnerable for abuse.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. Does the perpetrator groom his victim intentionally, or is this ingrained in him that comes naturally for him and he doesn't think it's wrong?
Yeah, well, see, that's an important question because, you know, oftentimes what we do see is that many times people who have been hurt, they tend to hurt other people. Or we can do it the other way around. People who abuse other people, oftentimes they themselves have been abused as well. And so for them, if they grew up in that kind of environment, um, of course they suffered it themselves. They know how terrible it is. But if that's all they knew, it could be that as they relate to other people, they will naturally engage in some of those behaviors, verbal abuse or emotional abuse, if that was the case, or even you know, physical abuse or sexual abuse. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not aware of what they're doing, you know, because they felt it at one point and it wasn't good for them. But it may be because they were so used to this, to seeing this modeled to them, that that's where they go. But oftentimes, you know, that's why we have to be able to talk to, if possible, you know, to people who have those experiences and those tendencies, because if they are perpetrating it by seeing us discuss what is abuse, what is okay, what is not okay, they can perhaps start to think about it. Well, maybe then what I'm doing is not right. And again, if somebody is in a relationship and they are experiencing that, because, you know, there could be sexual abuse within a marriage, for instance. You know, if there is no consent from the spouse fully, and the other spouse is forcing themselves, they could be perpetrating sexual abuse. And even though they're married, they still need to have the consent of their spouse. They can't just force themselves. And so once we try to explain some of what is abuse and what are the different forms that it takes, then people can be more aware, and then they can, you know, hopefully, if they need to seek help, like a counselor or someone, because this requires really somebody to help this person break away. Of course, God can help them as well. They can ask God for help, but many times we see that because of the scars and the experiences that perhaps they experience themselves, they need also healing from counselors and from other people that can help them heal and think differently about their behaviors. So cognitive behavior therapy can be helpful, or other forms of counseling. And certainly, as I mentioned, God can also heal their hearts, as we saw in Isaiah. But, you know, there's different types. There are people that may not be aware, but there are others that are aware of what they're doing. And the more that we try to educate people, more people will be able to identify some of these things as abusive.
Okay, there are 4 more questions, but I will just accommodate 2 more questions. So, who is
I'm
at
sorry, I
fault?
couldn't hear you
It says
very
here.
well.
I know this still be considered sexual abuse, harassment if the female or male willingly participated in a sexual that no matter the situation, then who is at fault, no matter what the psychological or power dynamic, wouldn't the person receiving sexual advances or is aware of sexual advances still have a choice to walk away?
Okay, I couldn't hear you in the beginning. It was very slow, and then it went very fast.
Here.
So if you can repeat, is that the question that is on the chat?
Is not. It's in the question and answer. Okay, I'll read it again.
Okay.
Would it still be considered sexual abuse or harassment if the female or male willingly participated in a sexual act or a relationship?
Okay.
Because it seems to me that no matter the situation, it's always the one in power.
Yeah, this is a very delicate issue here. Oftentimes people blame the, you know, both, because they say, well, they were consenting you know, they fell for it. Like I mentioned in the clergy situation, you know, even if the person becomes emotionally isolated and falls for, whether it's at work or, you know, in church, usually there is somebody who, if the sexual predator has intentionally tried to lure that person to fall for him or her, they are actually the one to blame, and the victim ends up being perhaps consenting, but they were in a lower power situation. And so again, they could have been intimidated into falling for that. If they are a student and is a teacher, same thing. It could be because of the power difference. That student, even though he or she might have consented, or even a child, you know, may let the adult do something, but they may not understand in that case. Of course, a child is never to blame. But even an adolescent, a young adult, or an adult who is in a very lower position of power, they may be lured into a situation where it was sexual, you know, they were sexually exploited or harassed. But normally for an adult, we look at consent, and that's, legally speaking, is usually the way that they differentiate and say it was or it was not sexual abuse. But I shared a little bit more deeply here with you, so you all could understand that even though the law may say, oh, she or he consented, it's not sexual abuse, there are these other elements at play that actually we need to be aware of. And to blame the victim for, you know, consenting or doing this without understanding this power struggle and the power and control, you know, wheel, sometimes we may miss the point here. But certainly, you know, there are occasions too where the pastor might have been lured by the member, you know, trying to convince and use those intentional strategies as well. So each case is different. We cannot say this is the case for everybody. You have to analyze each case and find what are the situations, what were the experiences, and what took place, without putting blame. You know, we have to be able to see who did what and what were the circumstances of each case.
Okay. One more, last one. What are the factors or reasons of clergy sexual misconduct? And then what are the suggested ecclesiastical stages in addressing sexual abuse that might occur in the church before we use legal steps as solution to this societal issue?
That's a very good question. The last question, we will be talking about that in the next session when we talk about what the church can do. But the first question you mentioned, if you can repeat, is talking about the reasons, right? What are the factors for clergy sexual misconduct? And, you know, again, there may be many different factors, that each situation may be different. But the fact is, sometimes in some circumstances, is just the stress of the work. And as I said, you know, it may start with private meetings or counseling, and maybe the pastor might be vulnerable in their own family relationship, and the person being attended to may also come from a situation that the pastor is trying to help, and that may end up being a risky situation. So we will talk about how to prevent that in the next step. But other times there are predators as well. And that's why I mentioned some of the signs, because it could be that the factors are related to something that person experienced themselves. And now, you know, it may happen to more than one person in their parish or in their church, that they are looking to as a predator to you know, exploit. So we cannot judge every case. There are different circumstances for each case, but we just need to be aware of the potential risk and try to minimize those risks. Certainly For pastors, we know there's a lot of stress. There is oftentimes a lot of problems within their own family that need to be addressed. And so that may be one of the risk factors too. If somebody's not happy in their own relationship, you know, it's so easy to feel respected and appreciated by a member. And sometimes that may be a path for this as well, when the pastor is not the one necessarily that is you know, the predator, but he may find himself in a situation where he just didn't put their guard, and the enemy, you know, is tempting everyone to, he wants to break families. And so setting some important things in place to prevent that, and one of them is seeking counseling themselves, you know, seeking to ensure that their family is as a clergy family is seeking help if there's a problem, so that this can prevent other further problems. But there are various others risk factors that can be, but these are some of them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katia. It's now our time for break. Water out, and that's for the next session. Okay, thank you. Relax.
心中有。
当遇到จิตใจmenyadap Tuhan.
Ada percaya
Berjenuh lebih percaya pada sabdanya. Biar-biar dan bergirau Yesus santai-santai tubuhkan menyanyi.
Haleluya Trung Krista
Chạy trong tâm lòng này bạn đi kiến nabo Bina kami
Hi, I'm Pastor Kevin, Adventist Volunteer Service.
Hello, where's everybody? Can we start now? Wow, my internet is not.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. Is everyone back now?
Everyone is on mute.
I'm back.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, now let's go to the second part of our lecture, but I will again introduce. Oh, do we need to have another special music, Jessica, before I introduce them, our speaker? No more.
Hindi na po. Hindi na po. Go
Wala.
ahead.
Okay. Okay, second part of the introduction. Actually, I did not introduce her more because I have to introduce the second time our speaker. Our speaker here, I printed the CV. It's 11 pages, and I just tried to look at the pages here, and then she has 5 research publications and 22 presentations, 10 editorial activities or reviews, and now other publications, 46, and so many more experiences. But I'm not going to read it all here today because we will listen about what the church can do to promote sexual abuse prevention in the workplace. And she is an expert in this because this is most of the focus of her research and her studies. So let's welcome back Dr. Katia Reinert, the only rose among the thorns in the health department of General Conference. Dr. Katia, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back. And hopefully I will answer some of the questions that came through. I tried to answer a little bit typing it, but I think we will discuss on this segment more clearly some things that we can do for prevention, but also what do we do when we find that there is perpetrators in a church or in a workplace, or what are some of the steps? And so we'll discuss some of that as well in the short time that we have. I think we only have 30 minutes for this part. So let me just go ahead and share this screen here. And okay, so again, this time we are focusing on what can faith communities do in terms of this issue of sexual abuse, particularly for churches, for workplace, for schools, and the community itself. And so, as I mentioned, we covered on the previous part the types of abuse, the health consequences, and the fact that there is ways that we can protect survivors through resiliency factors. But now we'll focus on what can communities do. And I will be mentioning in special way the End It Now initiative, which I'm hoping that most of you are aware of, and what we have learned as a church by focusing on that, and where is taking us now, and some resources that we can also benefit from. If we know that they are there, we can be more likely to use them. So I will start by saying that it's true that we have had this issue be a major, as I mentioned, a major public health problem in the past. And because of that, there has been all kinds of recommendations on what can we do. I mentioned to you children being particularly at risk, adolescents, but also adults, especially women in particular. So there has been a report from the Department of the CDC in the US, for instance. There's, I'm sure in every country there might be some form of a manual, but this one, Preventing Child Abuse Within Youth Serving Organizations, which includes churches, schools, is one that provides a lot of good information. But also the WHO has put out this Inspire report, 7 strategies for ending violence against children, including sexual violence against children. So because children are particularly at risk, there is a lot of information there of the kinds of things that we can do to prevent this among children, sexual abuse among children. As a church, we have the Adventist risk management, very much interested in preventing this. This is a problem. It can be a problem in churches, in our schools, and in any of the settings where we are serving children and young adults and youth. So this is just some examples of some of the materials available, and I'll send you a link. I'll show you a link at the end when we talk about resources of where you can find some of these things. But these are just some examples of materials available that you can go to look more clearly and finding specifics on prevention, because we won't have time to cover everything here. But for instance, there is strict and clear guidelines about what is good touch and what is bad touch when it comes from teachers, Sabbath school teachers, or even in a school setting with children, and for staff, whether it's a church or there's a school. It's important that we are very aware of those differences. And so the Adventist Risk Management has put this out, and there's a very good guidelines. For instance, in this case, always ask a child for permission to touch them before you touch them. When touching a child, only touch the shoulder level or above, except when necessary to ensure they're safe, if they're going to get hurt. Only give children side hugs, not front hugs. These are some of the recommendations for staff members. Do not engage in inappropriate physical contact of any kind, like rough physical play or physical reprimand or even horseplay. Those are things that in our churches, in our schools, when we're dealing with children, staff, Sabbath school teachers or other adults and pathfinders, youth leaders, they all need to be aware of. And there are many other kinds of things that Adventist Risk Management puts out. There's also a whole session on what to do when you have a sex offender in your church. And it's important that you protect people that can be vulnerable. I don't know in the Philippines or in some of the countries you are representing in the SSD division, but in other countries, there is something called a sex offender list. And so people are always alerted. In the US, this happens when a sex offender who has been registered as a sex offender is in the community or attends a church. They need to notify. And so people are aware. So what are some of the things that you need to do when you know somebody has had a history as a sex offender? There are certain guidelines and criteria. And again, we won't have time to go through all this, but this Adventist Risk Management, there's a couple of documents that go in detail, and I'll give you the link where you can download and see that. Another example that Adventist Risk Management has put out is starting your childhood protection plan, things, for instance, that children need to know so they can be protected in terms of understanding what is the inappropriate conduct of adults that are with them. And so there's, information that they can know. And also there are, again, more specific youth guidelines, supervision guidelines that people dealing with adolescents, children and adolescents need to know. So the kinds of things related to how many staff will be with children in various activities, how to handle children if they're high energy and if they are difficult, what kinds of things you can keep in mind to prevent any form of physical abuse, certainly sexual abuse being one. So just giving you some examples of the many other resources that are available to Adventist Risk Management to prevent some of these things. Now, what can we do more specifically, in terms of the various levels of the church? So I'm going to give you here some general suggestions that will fit every level of the church, the division level, the union, the local church, school, workplace, and we'll try to talk about each of them. But many of them can be very similar, but we'll discuss that. First of all, we need to begin to see this as a mandate as a church. In Proverbs 31:8, it's very clear said we need to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute, and people who are children or even other adults that are vulnerable for sexual abuse, they're survivors. Certainly, we need to speak up for them, and we need to be able to help them recover from that, and we need to stand for their rights. And so as a church, this should be part of our mandate. So when we understand that this is part of our biblical mandate, that should really have high priority at every level of the church. In such circumstances, it's very easy to hide the fact that we have a pastor or a teacher or someone who has had this issue as a sexual offender or has been implicated in a circumstance. And in some cases, it's easier to say, oh, let's not talk about it. Let's just keep it under the rug. And, we will transfer this person to another place but that doesn't solve the problem. And so we have to be able to really think carefully how best to help both the perpetrator to seek help, to find healing, to reverse their course, but also the survivor. And so I would like to just give you a brief overview of what the church already has done since early 2001. We have, as a church, developed some resources and things. And one of the first things we've done in this case in 1995 was already to vote as a church an official statement recognizing the issue related to gender-based violence, particularly violence against women and girls. We started with that. in the society and in the church, and that we would be agents of change, that we will help to end the evil of abuse. And that was early in 1995. So it's been almost 25 years now. And this has been part of this mandate and part of the mission of the church. And here you can see more details about this, the very detailed statement that talks about everything, the issue of all forms of abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and family violence being included in this and being seen as, you know, reaffirming the dignity of humans to not experience this kinds of violence, and also recognizing, you know, the various issues related to us as Christians living in a sinful world that need to respond to abuse and to family violence within the church and the community, and the fact that we should take seriously when any member, any student, anyone reports sexual abuse or violence or any form of abuse, and that this should be part of our discussions. And this is part of why we're doing this today. We were talking about this, it's part of our mandate. And even in 1995, we started talking about it. That's why I said earlier, it's a myth that the church is silenced. No, we have been trying to talk about it for decades now. And we accept our responsibility that we need to cooperate with other professional services. We need to listen. We need to care for those who are survivors, and we need to talk about the injustice and speak out in defense of the survivors, and the fact that we need to help them identify the services they need, like counseling, like some other form of, sometimes it may be even physical, medical, you know, help. But somebody had a question earlier talking about how can pastors take a role of being counselors when, you know, there's no psychologist, nobody in the church. We'll talk more about that, but ideally it would be for us to refer people to professionals who can offer mental health and counseling for the survivors and for the family who is struggling, or the perpetrator as well. But you know, this has been part of our church statement. And as a result of that, in 1995, 6 years after that, we started with what was called then the Abuse Awareness Day. In 2001, the church said that every fourth Sabbath of August, we would talk about abuse. We would highlight this as a problem. And back then, in 2001, when this started, again, almost 20 years ago, it was called the Abuse Awareness Day. Today, it has changed to what ended now, Emphasis Day, but it's still the fourth Sabbath of every August. We have, for the almost last 20 years, provided materials and especially separating this Sabbath day, the fourth Sabbath of August, to talk about all various issues related to abuse. And again, because we know it's part of the, you know, what God came to do, and also our mandate. Today, that date is still not known. In many places around the world where I go, and I ask, are you aware of it now? Are you aware of the first Sabbath of every August being the awareness day for abuse? People don't know. And I hope that all of you in this seminar who are watching will be now aware of this and actually seek to engage your local church, your school, your community during this time. And there are materials prepared that go back to almost 20 years. So all kinds of sermons and presentations and seminars are available that you can take a hold of. And hopefully in the SSD, you already have been using some of that. I know that it started with women's ministry, and they usually have materials available. But anyway, I wanted to just mention 2001, we started with that. Then after that, in 2007, the then General Conference President, Jan Paulsen, said and really supported the fact that we should not tolerate violence of any kind. It would be unacceptable, and that we needed to develop this culture of kindness and care and consideration. And it was after that, in 2009, that then we started with the End It Now initiative. This is like the boldest initiative that the Adventist Church then did after the Awareness Day that was created in 2001 to actually bring people to think about violence as a major issue, all forms of violence, including sexual violence, of course. But it was primarily led by women's ministry and ADRA at that point, because they were focusing on the gender-based violence, which is, as I said, one of the most common prevalent groups are women. And so they were to really motivate all individuals, the churches, every faith, all the social groups, the schools, and the workplace to stand up in favor of human rights and really raise awareness at that point to end violence against women and girls. They were going to get signatures, 1 million signatures, take it to the UN. At this point, to date, we have not reached 1 million. I think we reached around 600,000 signatures. But this initiative, since 2009 to today, which has been basically more than 11 years now, we have seen how the church has really become much more aware. It began as Adventists saying no to violence against women and girls. And then we learned that actually just women ministry talking about it, and ADRA did also at that time. And then later on, women's ministry took it along themselves. We needed men to be aware, to be engaged. We needed children to be also engaged. And so this initiative over the last 10 years have evolved. And in this quinquennium in 2015, it was expanded to include every ministry. So not every ministry, but particularly those ministerial pastors, health ministries, we are involved, children's ministries, as well as family ministries, and education, our schools, as well as women ministries. And so including more people really is what we needed to do, and expand sexual abuse to not only girls and women, but everyone, because males also may suffer. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there are other kinds of abuse, so elder abuse and all forms of things. So this allowed us to actually, and you can see here the many different church ministries that are engaged now in the End It Now initiative, from women's ministry to health to family to ministry association to youth and children's ministry as well. And so all of them, all of us together, we're speaking against abuse. And so this has made a much bigger impact, not only about women and girls, but as I said, everyone who experiences that. And many things have come out of that. And here are some of the recommendations. For instance, in terms of the global and the division level, we see now a huge emphasis that we need to expand this ministry, such as End It Now, to make it separate, maybe ideally a funded department if we can, so that it can actually move this whole initiative and really develop more and more policies and really look culturally at each division and what is expected there, so that they can really follow through on what works at a division, and also work culturally for different countries. So work to foster this culture that we have to respect the rights and dignity of all people, gender, ethnicity, etc. And then in the case specifically of establishing hotlines and other kinds of experts available for people who are experiencing abuse, they need to be utilized and incorporated. And also the fact that we would need to have training for pastors and for leaders that were in colleges and seminaries, so that when they come out of seminaries, they actually are able to already know a lot about this and be able to do better. So at a global and division level, these were and are things that we can do in terms of helping educate our pastors, our leaders, in terms of how to deal with both perpetrators as well as prevention and helping the survivors. Likewise, at the union level and the local conference level, this kind of training needs to be available for all the leaders in regards to abuse and family violence, but also specifically in this case, we're talking about sexual abuse, which is so common. And so I discussed some of the Adventist risk management things, but we need especially a curriculum that can be available. And we, are working on something right now that hopefully can be helpful. But even within each division or each union conference, if we have that available for leaders, that would make a huge impact as well. And so seminars and trainings, such as what we're doing today, the division is offering this. Other camp meetings that you have, including this, is very important. Incorporating this in all the ministries, as we mentioned, is integrating this into all that we do makes a huge difference as well. In terms of all the ministries, here are some of them. And one that we have most recently now, very happy to see that's been added, is the top administrators at the division, at the union. We just had our spring meeting this year. And in this spring meeting, the president of the General Conference, Elder Wilson, has really gave, it started even before the spring meeting, but the division officers had to report on the challenge that they were given by the GC leadership to actually be engaged specifically on sexual abuse and what will the division be doing about it. And so they have to come up with plans and what they would do. So now we are engaging the top administrators in terms of evaluating what they can do in the division, in the union, in the conferences, and how they can ensure there are policies in place to deal with perpetrators as well as with survivors of sexual abuse specifically. So these are things that are now being taught by division officers and the leadership. And in the next meeting we have in the fall council, we will be hearing from them on more specifics on this. Now, beyond all those ministry leaders and administrators, each member in the local church, also each leader in the local church has a role to play. And so participation is key from us. And so some of the things that we suggest, and it's part of the ended now, but just focusing on this abuse prevention, is developing a team locally. And this can, I'm going to look at the local church and then some of the other institutions as well, but they're very similar. Developing a team that can actually work on this, assess the needs and provide training for the clergy and the leaders in the church about sexual abuse and how to recognize and what to do. Provide pledge cards for leaders and members to sign. There is an Ended Now pledge card where people pledge that they will do what they can to raise awareness and end violence. And these are available. Partner with other domestic violence programs that can offer help for survivors of sexual abuse. And sometimes these domestic violence programs offer counseling and offer other kinds of support as well for somebody, for instance, that needs to have medical help or even needs to come out of a relationship from an intimate partner who is not a healthy relationship, and how to go about that. I also have literature and resources available. There are many resources that have been developed, brochures and books and other things that are available that can be helpful. I mentioned some of them through Adventist Recovery, Adventist Risk Management, but Women's Ministry has, through the Ended Now initiative, provided a lot of resources. And then again, as I mentioned, host the Ended Now Sabbath every year and other annual awareness activities during the Ended Now Awareness Day, so that we can engage the members of the church, the leaders, and the community in this. And so having an action plan for the local church and how to respond to survivors and how to help perpetrators is very important and critical. Now, in order to help the local church, but this can also be used by schools and by other settings like, even workplace. The Ended Now initiative in the North American division developed this step-by-step response. How do you respond to somebody who claims they've been sexually assaulted or there have experienced some form of abuse. And this document, I won't have time to go step by step, but if it is a minor, it is a legal problem. And so you have to believe the child, and you have to involve the police or social work, and you have to engage with that, because it becomes a major issue. So there's different things here that you ask yourself in order to assess whether or not you need to call the police right away, or how to assist the person. And if they're emotionally stable, whether they need counseling right away, or how active listening, and what are the actions that you need to do to provide the legal counseling, the emotional support, the health and safety, which is a major issue, and also the psychological help. So this is a very helpful kind of guide, and of course we have to always believe the victim, the survivor, saying that they were victimized. Do not ask for proof of violence. Assure that it's not their fault, and also reassure that you will keep confidentiality. This is a major issue, especially in the case of sexual assault, that you can explain the boundaries of confidentiality. In case it is a minor, then you have to seek help. You cannot just keep confidential. But many times, if it is an adult, you also, depending on the circumstance, you have to depend on what the victim wants to do. You cannot force the victim to go to the police. You cannot go to the police unless the person who experienced the sexual assault wants you to go, if they are an adult. If they are a minor, it's our duty to go. But if they're an adult, you have to have consent. And so there's all kinds of things here that are important. And so in terms of the action, it's important to supply information for them, to know the contact numbers they need, make yourself available, especially if they are an adult. And then document what happened in some place if you are a leader. But always remember, if children are involved, you are mandated to report to Child Protective Services. And I believe you have to think about your country. I know there are many countries represented here. I think most countries, this is mandated. Check with your country just in case. But this is an example, and again, you can use this as a model later if you want to. Now, we discussed early clergy sexual misconduct, and I want to just talk about things to avoid. 7 tips that can help us avoid clergy sexual misconduct, and I mentioned some of this in some of my answers earlier. But for one thing, it's very important that pastors, that clergy, do not engage in therapeutic counseling one-on-one, alone with someone. This can be a major risk factor. So always inviting someone from the family. If it is a couple therapy, it's okay. But if one-on-one, it's always better, especially if it's the other's different gender. Then you always want to ask somebody to be there with you. Discuss relationship questions with mentors or colleagues outside of the congregation. So if you're having issues with relationships, with your own family, as we talked about, talk with mentors and talk with colleagues outside of the congregation, not with members of the congregation, because that can again raise a risk. I already mentioned, avoid meeting alone with anyone one-on-one. Always try to have talk to people with your elder or somebody else present. Keep messaging professional. Always be careful. The text messaging, the kind of message that goes, between clergy and members should be always professional. And as we mentioned, keep physical contact professional. No hugging, kissing, those kinds of things. You have to keep a distance. Right now with pandemic, everybody's having to keep the distance. But when we're back meeting in person, this is important. Be aware of giving and receiving personal gifts. That's another thing that you want to avoid to prevent issues, and keep current on what are the best practices of preventing abuse. And we have voted some guidelines, and you can find this against sexual harassment. In 1988, And if you go to adventist.org article sexual harassment, there is a link, and on another resource I will show you in the end, and now North America website, there's links to all these things. So this is one of the documents that since 1988 we have guidelines against sexual harassment that you can follow, and it's important that the clergy and other leaders and teachers follow that to prevent issues. But again, you know, we need to educate ourselves and others, and keep a culture. And there are many other steps here, you know, that we can do, but these are some of the things that can be done in a local church, like try to keep a list of resources in the area, try to preach and send messages of understanding what the Bible really say, with clarifying texts that sometimes are used for abuse to excuse abuse. You can, as a member, volunteer yourself, or even as a leader, host prayer groups, and question the beliefs and traditions that sometimes, as I mentioned, they condone gender violence or discrimination. And many other things, you know, talking to the pastor, keeping confidentiality, are all things that are important, including a list of resources in the community. One other thing is to help to get acquainted. What are the shelters and referral sources in your community that can provide services, as I mentioned, counseling services or other things, and also provide the materials that Indy now has, and many other materials from risk management. Make sure the church has these materials for the church leaders, and create one or more safe houses, perhaps, where people can go for shelter, especially members, but sometimes community people as well. We have developed, as I mentioned, lots of sermons and workshops that are available. We can be used during the end and now Sabbath. But again, look at the church policies and practices to make sure that you are able to follow that and support both the perpetrator for help as well as the survivor. This is an example of, you know, some years ago we did the Words That Wound, which is an emotional abuse, but we have had one on sexual abuse as well in the past, and you want to reach those resources as well as brochures that are available. Now, through this, you can also reach the community. So developing collaborators in the community, as well as hosting in and out events that engage the community, making these resources available in the community are very important. Looking for partners that are in the community that are interested in domestic violence programs as well, and help them and their support, their shelters, and collaborate with them for raising awareness in the community. There are many community projects that people are doing around the world that could be done, and these are just some examples of them, right? Care packages for hospitals, safe homes, empowering people economically, especially women and children, literacy training, girls conferences and training, and safe homes and shelters. Now for schools, a lot of the same things we talked about for the church can be applied for school as well. And one of the main things, I think, besides some of the same issues, is also partner for training for teachers and the staff, so that they are very aware of the things they need to understand, what good touch is, bad touch is, and how to deal with that. And I think our schools have more of policies on how to deal with that from a teacher's perspective, and follow that very carefully. And Advanced Risk Management is a great help here. But we can also do awareness days in schools, just like we do in the church, and provide literature and other things as well as help and referrals for survivors and perpetrators. In the workplace, likewise, oftentimes it's very easy, as I said, to take a leader, somebody who is in leadership working for the church, and, you know, we see that sometimes they are moved to another place, another situation. But it's important that we deal with the issue, that actually they are offered help as a perpetrator, and also the survivors. And so some of these things here we discussed with school and community, they are important for the workplace as well. Why not host something on the Ended Now, you know, last week in August, and assess the needs of the workplace, provide training for people. It may be that you can provide training to all employees and require them to go through that on abuse recognition and how to prevent sexual harassment, recognize sexual harassment, and to communicate clear policies, both for perpetrators as well as for survivors of sexual abuse and how to help them. So these are some of the things. And the time is up. I will tell you, and here I'll just briefly show you, these are some examples of places around the world that leaders have been doing awareness campaigns. We have schools where children who have been, you know, survivors of sexual abuse have come to. In this case, this is one in ECD. Other times, places where they are engaging with the community. We have in Brazil, as an example of the Breaking the Silence or End It Now, where even, you know, whole states are using the Awareness Day, following the Adventist Church leadership and highlighting abuse. There's magazines, there's big events that are done. And some of your own division there, you know, you can see in Bangladesh, you can see other places as well. In India is a different division, but this is a different division as well. Various things being done. This is in your division in Thailand. We have with ADRA project, the Keep the Girls Safe. Again, another school for girls who are in need, and many times they can be sold for sex trafficking and other kinds of things. And sometimes they are survivors of sexual abuse. And so certainly partnership with ADRA is a great opportunity. And the Awareness Day is one of the main things that we need to take advantage of. This is an example of a local church that actually is spending their ministry into the local prison and helping survivors of sexual abuse. And this is one girl talking about their experience of sexual abuse and how through the church they have been helped and how they're now finding a job, you know, and surviving that. And so these are leaders that are involved. So we need to continue doing research on this in every division to find out numbers and what we can do to help. In North America, there is an annual summit on abuse that I encourage you to continue. Other divisions also are doing this, but helping to educate everyone, church leaders, as well as school and camps, you know, and workplace, so that we can learn from our lessons and be able to implement what we now are focusing on, which is to have of clear guidance for each division in terms of what can we do to support survivors and deal with perpetrators. Until now, we don't have very clear policies. Now the church is being challenged to come up with this. And we should, as I said, in the fall, see reports from every division. So I encourage SSD to, I'm sure that they're working on this, to be able to present their plans, and then we will see with each division what the plans are. And here are some of the websites and contacts if you want to reach some of these resources that we mentioned here. The End It Now North America has a lot of documents, but then just the regular End It Now initiative has it as well. The Awareness Days, you can ask the Women's Ministry team there in SSD, or you can also see it here on this website. And certainly we are here to help as well. There are other resources outside of our church as well who are helpful. There is this on top from the Christian Coalition for International Health. They have a whole page of lots of resources for sexual and gender-based violence that you may want to look at. And then there are other places, and including there are also apps on the phone sometimes that people can use to look for safety and look for resources. So just ending here, I know time is of essence, and so we are troubled in every side, says the Bible, but we don't have to be distressed. We are perplexed, but we don't have to be in despair. Many times we are persecuted, cast down, and there are all kinds of problems we can face, but no one needs to be destroyed. And God is able to make us resilient in spite of what we might have experienced in terms of sexual abuse, and He can bring healing for us. So I pray that we can continue to grow as a church in what we can do to respond to particularly sexual abuse, and that we can be able to be an agent of change and healing in our churches and communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katia. Now, I have some questions here from the chat box.
Okay.
Katia, thank you so much. That message is really very timely. That is what we needed most now. So my first question here is, let's go to question and answer first. What needs to be done when a church leader organization tries to cover the incident of abuse among clergy, church leaders, for fear of being shamed as a church?
Yeah,
Shall we do?
that is a very common
So-
issue. Oftentimes, you know, that there is shame involved with this. But that's why I think as a church, more than ever right now, we are asking that the top leadership of each region comes up with plans, and we hope to have very clear policies on how can we make perpetrators accountable, instead of just, you know, because we are afraid of shaming or this or that, that we just let it go and, you know, we keep it under the rug, as I mentioned. We hope to develop very clear policies that can be very soon available, maybe within the year, for local leaders to implement. Right now, we're in the process of doing that. Of course, each situation is different, so a lot of things need to be considered. But I think that it does not help the perpetrator or the survivor just to ignore it or to just not say anything because we don't want to shame them. The reality is that person needs help, and so does the survivor. And if that is happening right now, we need to talk about it. That needs to change. And maybe, you know, look to see who is the person responsible that could do something about this. And if they're not responding, go to the higher level and talk about this. Because right now, as I mentioned to you, Elder Wilson has asked the top leadership of the divisions, the officers, to come up with a plan for helping the survivor and to make the perpetrator accountable with policies. And so this is a mandate, and we hope to soon have some clear policies that will drift down to every level. But if that's not yet happening, we need to speak up and to be able to advocate for those, not to shame them and say, oh, you should be excluded and just, you know, not be part of anything. No, we need to provide help for the perpetrator, but at the same time, with kindness, you know, but they do need help. Just like we would provide help for somebody with a drug addiction, with, you know, another kind of behavior that may not fit with our values and goals. In this case, particularly because this is inflicting wounds on another person. And so it's a very serious behavior that needs to be followed through.
Okay, thank you. And here's a follow-up question. Is there a program for those who are abusive or perpetrators? Is there?
Very good question. So first of all, persons who are perpetrators, as I mentioned, oftentimes they do need counseling. Our church right now, as it is, does not offer a specific program or you know, resource for perpetrators, and we hope to maybe be able to offer that. But in the meantime, we need to be able to refer this person for psychological counseling. Of course, they need spiritual counseling as well, and, you know, be able to seek God. But oftentimes, perpetrators have wounds themselves that need to be healed, and so they need to speak about that and to find psychological help. And again, it may be best that is not left for the pastor to do this. It needs to be somebody with an understanding of a history of a trauma and abuse, and to be able to help the perpetrators. And some communities and in some countries, I know, for instance, here in the US where I live, there are community programs for perpetrators to attend. It could be that in the country where you are, there might be something available. So you may want to find out what is available where you are. As I mentioned, one of the steps that is important for us to take is for each of us to, if we want to be doing comprehensive health ministry, find out the resources, materials, everything we can on this issue in our region where we live, so we can use that to help and refer others as well. As we know right now, as a church, we don't have one, but in the meantime, we refer people for counseling and for other programs available in our area.
Okay, thank you. Another question. We would like abuse prevention program to be widely promoted and carried out in all mission, conferences, and local churches. However, we experience the friction, and I believe it is from the protective mentality on ministry boundaries. What would be your practical advice from the GC so that all involved ministries like women's ministries, health, children, family, ministerial education, and youth may come to terms and share the same understanding and sense of urgency, and be willing to collaborate to make things happen in a consistent manner as our combined effort in addressing this issue?
Very important question. This is oftentimes a challenge indeed in various churches or settings. And I think that one of the ways to deal with this is, as I mentioned in this presentation, ideally would be to first talk with the pastor that this is something the church is putting very high value on. And we are being called to do something more about this from the local church and every other level. But I'm assuming that the question is, what can you do in the local church? Certainly, as I said, it needs to happen at the division level, at the union level and conference level, that these ministries build an end and now team and talk about how they're going to promote this issue from a conference, from a union, division perspective. But at the local church, likewise, it would be good to have an end and out team that the pastor is a part of, and then women's ministry leader, youth, all the ministry leaders participate in this end and out team and plan what they would do. Of course, the awareness day is an important day that they can plan for using the resources that are already available. They don't need to create resources, but certainly they can plan together. And it takes one. Maybe in the GC, the women's ministry is taking the lead, and that department brings all the other departments with them, and encourages them to come, and we make plans together. And maybe that is the model that can be used in the local church for the women's ministry, talking to the pastor, inviting the other leaders of the other church, the other ministries, to be part of this end and now team, and then plan what they would do. That would be my recommendation. It's working for us here, but certainly we can improve even more. But that can possibly be a good way to deal with this from every level of the church down to the local church as well.
Okay, I think those are the questions for now. And Jessica, we would like to say thank you so much. Let us give a round of applause to Dr. Katia.
Praise God. Thank you for the opportunity. I see somebody's asking if I can provide the presentation. I will send it to Lelaine.
Yes, thank you. And now for appreciation, we will give you a certificate of appreciation, and it will be given through email, but let me read it. Certificate of appreciation. Because you have served the Lord in his territory in Southern Asia Pacific Division through the faithful exercise of your precious gifts of giving a lecture entitled General Introduction on Abuse and What the Church Can Do to Promote Sexual Abuse Prevention in the Workplace, Church, Schools, and Community, to the participants of the health webinar entitled Scaling Up, Comprehensive Health Ministry. And because the body of Christ in this part of the world had been enriched by your faithfulness, we award this certificate of appreciation to you. Dr. Katia
Aw.
Reinert, given this 24th day of June in the year of our Lord 2020. Signed, President SSD Samuel Sau, Executive Secretary Rudy Baloyo, Treasurer Max Langi, and our Director, Health Ministries Director Maria Rizalin Alfanoso.
Thank you. That is so kind of you. Beautiful. I would cherish it. And I
Yeah,
pray that
Jessica will
your
send-
ministry will be blessed as well.
Thank you so much. Jessica will email it to you from Ma'am Lalaine. Okay, Dr. Lalaine, thank you so much for making it possible, for making us be able to have face-to-face, even through the Zoom.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Dr. Katia. Thank you. Shall we give a round of applause to Dr. Katia?
Thank you. Praise God. Thank you for the opportunity. It was my delight. I was blessed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katia. Now I think it's
Read.
nearly 12 midnight in your place. So I guess it's time for you to
It's time to go to bed.
yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Katia. We'd like to invite you again next time. Next month, we will have our virtual international cooking show. So,
Fantastic. Wow. You guys have a full plan ahead. I'm excited to see that. God bless you in that. That's a wonderful opportunity you're taking.
okay. Thank you
If I
again.
can participate, I'll be happy to.
Thank you again. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Dr.
Good
Katia,
night to everyone. God bless you all.
thank you. One more thing. Thank you for sharing to us the PowerPoint presentation. They all love to have it.
Okay, I will send it to you, the link to the slide, so you can share with them. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you again. Can we have a picture of you?
Sure.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. God bless you all.
Thank you. God bless. God bless. Okay, everyone. Ate Nympha, kindly invite them for this afternoon session, please. Ma'am Nympha.
Okay, I am inviting everyone. Please attend our session this afternoon, our last session, 2 o'clock. Please remember to come 2 o'clock. See you in the afternoon. Okay, have a good lunch. Bye-bye.
Have a good lunch. Yeah, we have two very qualified and important resource person. We have Dr. Oratai Churison So and also Dr. Neda June Salazar. So kindly come back to 1:30. We will open the Zoom platform at 1:30. Okay, so again, thank you so much, everyone. God bless. And let's have our closing prayer. Ate, who will offer the closing prayer?
I can't find my directors here, so okay, let us pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for being with us, for the message that we have just heard. Help us, dear Father, to apply it in our work, in our workplace, wherever we are. Bless each one of us, and thank you for answering our prayers. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 And see you again this afternoon. So we would like to thank South Philippine Conference Adventist Hospital Davao. You're now having lunch. SPUC Adventist Hospital Davao. Hello. so much for being with us. Thank you. Maintain social distancing. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, there are a lot of them. Hello, hello, beautiful and handsome. Uy, Santiago na ito. Adventist Hospital Santiago. My friends over there in Santiago City. Hello, hello, madam. Okay. And we have SPUC Central Mindanao, the beautiful and the handsome. Okay. Let's
Hi everybody! Just by Goong and Sanitarium.
Sanitarium and Hospital. Hello.
Ang lalim doon. Ang singer namin. Ay, singer.
O yung singer. Mami. Ano ha?
Kamaya mag-special siya.
Mamaya, sir, ha? Ang ating friend na si, Sir Burda. Okay, from Sam. So they left already. Hello, Sam, 7-day Adventist Maranatha Seminary in Bangladesh. Well, I saw there a lot of you there a while ago, but you left already. Please come back, okay? Thank you. 7-day Adventist Maranatha Seminary of Bangladesh. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, we have a lot.
Adventist Medical Center, Valencia.
Valencia, hello. Hello, hello. Thank you so much at SPUC Valencia. Maraming salamat po.
AMC, Valencia.
Adventist Medical Center, Valencia. Saan pa? Itong kumakain na sila eh.
Kain ka na rin, mama. Mamaya magsisimula na naman. It's time to eat.
It's time to eat. Thank you, Ate Nympha. Thank you, Pastor Ray. Thank you, Pastor Soserne.
Hindi pa paano lang siguro.
Nandun yun.
Jadi
Thank you all.
ada 15,8 miliar
Thank you,
yang
ma'am.
tidak tercapai.
Thank you, Ma'am Elsa.
Hi, ma'am.
Thank you, Ma'am Elsa.
Welcome, ma'am.
Anggota komite bisa melihatnya.
Thank you also.
Dikasih akses.
Thank you.
Pastor Soserne. Thank you.
Oke. Lihat apa lagi? Sebenarnya
Thank you, ma'am.
screen tadi.
Sister Nayab,
Yes, ma'am.
stay for a while. Let's have some meeting with Pastor Soserne.
Okay.
Okay. Doon sa maraming.
Wala naman lang. Malaking
Mga onta, Sir John Ray. Regards.
Brada.
Kumbati, kumbati.
Ate.
Brada John, brada.
Nakamute mo.
Nakamute po, nakamute.
Panahon na nato mag-istorya. Kuma naman sila.
Ikaw na po lecture.
Ikaw na po lecture, John.
Kanta, Jun. Kantahin daw, sugdi-sugdi.
Mapawag ka na. Hindi magaling.
Regards kay Ma'am Ate Ang.
Hello, Mami. Hello, Mami.